with Iran be revived? My name is Kelly Blahos, and I am a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute, which, if you are not familiar with our organization, is a think tank dedicated to helping transform U.S. foreign policy from an approach of global military primacy to one of robust diplomatic engagement with the world. It's been a tumultuous news cycle, and not much positivity has come from the conclusion of the renewed talks in Vienna this week between Iran and the JCPOA partners, including Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China. In fact, the talks just concluded, so we are probably leading the first serious analysis on this topic today. The headlines, of course, throughout the week have been mixed. On Thursday, the IAEA released a report saying that Iran has again escalated its enrichment of uranium. Secretary of State Blinken, in a New York Times report today, said that Iran's recent moves, quote, don't give us a lot of cause for optimism. For its part, Iran played down the news of the IAEA report and continues to argue that it is willing to comply with the terms of the agreement from which the U.S. withdrew in 2015 if all sanctions levied against it since that withdrawal are lifted. This is just a slice of the dynamics playing out today, which is why we are so happy to have a stellar panel of experts to make sense of this week's talks and to chart out what the pathway forward might look like. I would like now to pass you to our moderator, Tom O'Connor, who will introduce our esteemed panelists and begin this much needed conversation. Tom is an award-winning journalist who works as a senior foreign policy writer at Newsweek. He has previously written for International Business Times, the New York Post, the Daily Star in Lebanon, and the Staten Island Advance, and has served as a fellow at the Foreign Press Center in Japan and the Korea Society. I know this panel is in great hands, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So please, Tom, take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kelly. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here, and I welcome everyone to this panel that we're having today. It's exciting to see so many guests. Obviously, as Kelly said, this is a very important time to have this, a very opportune time to have this panel. So without further ado, I'll introduce our very distinguished guests who will be speaking today. And before I do, I just want to note that throughout this panel, we'll be taking questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function and to submit questions throughout, and hopefully we'll get to them between the conversation. We'll talk to the panelists, we'll take some questions, and I think that hopefully we'll have a very great conversation today. So I'll start with, we have with us today Dr. Mahsa Rouhi, who serves as a research fellow at the Center for Strategic Research at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Rouhi. We have Eric Brewer with us, who's the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Project on Nuclear Issues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you very much, Eric. Looking forward to hearing from you as well. And of course, Dr. Trita Parsi, who's the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, who's hosting this event right now. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with a couple opening questions, and these first questions will kind of go around with. We'll start with you, Dr. Rouhi, since you're first to be introduced. Then we can go to Eric and Trita. The first thing I kind of want to ask right now is just a very general take. You know, the 7th round of talks has just ended right now, and I want to know kind of your optimism versus pessimism, or as to kind of the results, what we've seen as far as the statements coming out of them and where the two parties are. So let's start there with Mahsa. Do you want to take us off right now?
Sure. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'll have to start with a quick disclaimer that what I shared today are my personal views based on my individual research and does not represent National Defense University's views. Yes, the talks just concluded now. There seem to be mixed impressions, as I see, from different sides. Some are disappointed, some are, but I think mostly not anybody expected a breakthrough within this very short period of time, especially after the resumption of the talks. And there are some major issues to be discussed. I think the disappointment, particularly from the European side, is coming from that they expected more to be drawn from where the talks ended in June. But I think many of the experts sort of who are following this knew that the reason why Iran took some time to resume the talks is that some of the issues at the time were unresolved. And so if the deal were to be made at the time, it would have been made, kind of. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And, you know, it's hard to say whether one is optimistic or pessimistic, because it very much depends on how much each side is now assessing their flexibility moving forward. I think this round was just for everybody to get a sense of what's to come and what to expect in terms of demands and expectations and the possibilities and the realities on the ground. So I think it would be important to sort of follow on and see how the internal debates in Iran and in Europe and in the US particularly was going to play out in the next few weeks.
Got it. Thank you so much for that, Mahsa. And Eric, what do you think about this? How do you evaluate the situation so far?
Yeah, I think overall, you know, when it comes to the big question of whether or not the JCPOA can be revived, I am admittedly pessimistic. I say this as somebody who was in favor of the JCPOA, thought it was a very, very beneficial deal, and wants to see it revived, right? Written pretty extensively about this, you know, wanted to see the deal revived. But I think overall, I don't think that's likely. And my basis for that is really less kind of the play-by-play of the most recent round, although I do think, I don't think anyone was expecting a breakthrough, but I think it was perhaps a little bit less than where I at least hoped that we ended up. And so, you know, I'm really pessimistic because of some of these fundamentals, right? And really two basic reasons why I think that revival is unlikely. First, I think the US and the E3 and Iran are really just too far apart on their requirements for restoration of the deal. And there's a whole lot of reasons as to why that is that I think we'll get into through the course of this conversation. You know, I think Iran's concerns that it's expressed so far about a future US president withdrawing from the deal, about not receiving the economic benefits that it expects, I think those are all very understandable concerns. But I think the solutions that are being put forward are either not ones that the United States can really accept or provide, or they go beyond the scope of the JCPOA. And so I think these are things that, because they are genuine concerns, if we're to tackle them, they need to be tackled and addressed as part of a separate agreement. And the second reason why I'm less optimistic, more pessimistic, however you want to phrase it, than most, is that even if these differences could be resolved, and you know, I'll admit maybe they can, doing so would take a long time. And the Iranian nuclear clock is, I think, moving faster than it would take to resolve those deals. And we talked about some of these at the outset, right? I mean, from the standpoint of the United States, it's losing the non-proliferation benefits of some of this. That includes through Iran's advanced centrifuge work, which is knowledge, obviously, that cannot be changed, through Iran's production of HEU, through Iran's production of uranium metal, which, you know, is something that is particularly relevant to the weaponization of a device. So I think that's particularly worrying. So collectively, all these things are kind of, you know, if they continue, are going to continue to diminish the value for the United States. Of course, that's not to say a deal isn't possible. I think that a deal is possible. It's just probably not the JCPOA. And I think, you know, we probably have to see some changes in the current dynamics to get to that place to where a diplomatic bargain is achievable.
Sure. Well put. And Trita, what do you think? What's your take on this?
First of all, I thank you so much for doing this, and thank you to Mahsa and Eric. And I thought those comments are all very valid. I have to first start off by saying, look, everyone is probably not delighted to see that there wasn't a breakthrough, but let's also be very clear, no one expected it. I think this almost followed the script quite clearly from how it was written even before the talks began. We knew that the new Iranian side was going to come in with demands that most likely were going to be quite excessive. We knew that the United States and Europe were going to reject them. We knew that it was probably not likely that the Iranians already had a second move approved, meaning that they didn't need to go back and consult the capital. So the idea that this would happen this way, I think, was expected. What is positive in all of this is that A, they did schedule a second session, and B, that second round is going to be as soon as next week. And particularly mindful of the fact that there are valid concerns on the American and the European side that the Iranians are not taking this seriously enough. They're not at least certainly not pretending to be as concerned about the situation as Washington is, it is positive that that next round is taking place so soon rather than it being postponed till after Christmas. Now, on the substance, however, Eric may be quite right. Perhaps the Iranian position coming in was even more excessive than what the Biden team had expected. I'm not so sure it is, but from what I've heard, the Iranians are asking for the sanctions to be all lifted all at the same time. We have heard that before. I'm not sure that the Iranians expect that to happen. But they were also talking about that the reductions in their activities, including, for instance, going back down to 3.67% enrichment, would be happening gradually as they would be monitoring as to whether the sanctions relief actually is working. And this goes to what Eric was saying, that, perhaps the sides are so far away from each other and the fundamentals are so difficult that it's really difficult to revive it. I just want to give a quick comment as to why I think the Iranians are taking this position. They're taking this position, I think, because they know European companies are not going to come back into Iran, even with the sanctions being relieved. They're going to be waiting. They're going to be waiting to see what happens, perhaps as long as to 2024, to see, is it Ted Cruz that is going to be the next president of the United States or not? So then the Iranians are in a situation in which they're giving up their leverage, they're going down on their nuclear activities, but they're not getting the economic benefit, or at least not the full scope of the economic benefit, until perhaps 2 years later, assuming that there is a democratic victory. These are the dynamics that didn't exist in the same way back in 2015. They do exist now. And part of it is that because of changes on this side, divisiveness, some political instability over here, our promises are just not worth what they were before. The other side have legitimate reasons to wonder whether we will keep our word. And we're not doing much to convince them otherwise. And that actually is reducing not just the value of American promises, but it's also reducing the value of any American stick in this. And that is creating a very dangerous situation. I am still not as pessimistic as I think Eric is, and we can talk more as to why, but we have to be very clear-eyed that the fundamentals are not looking fantastic.
Sure, and I do thank you all very much for that. And I do want to hone in on that point right now about the U.S. ability to give assurances and sort of the domestic situation here. If we're going to focus on the two parties, I want to start with the U.S. side real quick. And obviously, the domestic situation right now with the Biden administration is facing is very different than back in 2015 under the Obama administration. And so, this seems to be part of the obstacles facing the talks right now, that the Iranians are looking for a sort of assurance from the U.S. side. And this, and we have to be honest here, this comes at a time when the Biden administration seems to be quite vulnerable politically, especially on foreign policy issues, but also domestically. So Eric, going back to you, you first brought up assurances, I believe. I kind of want to get your take on how you feel the Biden administration's domestic situation right now is affecting its position in talks and its willingness or commitment really to get this through. Is it something that would encourage them to, or are they worried about the Republican backlash at home? I think you're on mute, Eric.
Muted. This is like my first time using Zoom, right? No, Tom, before I go there, I do want to talk about something that Trita said, because you raised a really good point. And it's something that I think bears focusing on for a minute.
Please.
I agree. I think it is a huge problem about the U.S. ability to, quote unquote, keep its word and, sustain agreements that it reaches with countries. And I think this is not just true in the Iran case. I think this is true moving forward. I think the same dilemma would apply if the U.S. were to enter into any agreement with a country like North Korea, for example, which is also obviously going to entail sanctions relief as part of any bargain. So I think this is a problem, the political polarization within the United States and how that affects our ability to negotiate arms control and non-proliferation agreements, I think is a major problem. I think coming up with those solutions, and I know Masa has done work on this area, I think developing those solutions is really important. I think it's going to take too long for us to do that in the context of the JCPOA. And so I think these are things that, again, given enough time, perhaps the United States and Iran could address and could come up with mechanisms and workarounds that, address US political and legal requirements, but also address Iranian requirements. I think those are things that are going to take too long given the time that we have on the clock. I would also add, I'm a little bit in the minority camp here. I don't think it's a given that a future Republican president leaves the JCPOA again. Is it likely? Probably. Is it a 100% certainty? No, I wouldn't go there. And obviously this depends on a whole range of things. But I think looking back to the decision that President Trump made, at that time, he came in office and he didn't leave the deal for a full year and a half. And the reason why he didn't leave that deal was because all of his advisors were counseling against it, right? And so I think there's a good chance that despite what some politicians say, once they get in office and once they have a group, and there goes my lights in my office, once they have a group of advisors and those who are within government talking about the downsides that are going to happen as a result of that, I think there's wiggle room, right? And so I don't automatically go to the conclusion that a future Republican president would withdraw. To your question about, is the U.S. domestically, or is the Biden administration domestically constrained as part of reviving the deal? I mean, look, I think they definitely take into account the domestic political arena on that calculation, but I don't think it's preventing them from doing things they might otherwise think are a good idea, if that makes sense, right? I mean, I think the commitment, that they've made to adhere to the deal if Iran does the same, I don't think that there's like some other, legal or otherwise solution that could be put in place that they're not doing because of fear of a domestic backlash. But of course, I think as they continue to negotiate a return to the JCPOA and think about how to work out some of these sticky issues that have arisen since 2018, of course, I'm sure the political calculation is in the back of their minds, if not at the forefront of their minds.
Thank you very much for that. So Masa, as Eric said, you do look in some of these solutions, and he said that time is a factor here. Do you believe that time is too short to find solutions? And what sort of mechanisms do you believe, if you do believe, can be put in place to sort of bring these two very far parties closer together in time to make some sort of agreement?
Thank you, Tom. These are some great points. I'm going to start by saying when we talk about assurances and guarantees and U.S. keeping its on the sanctions, we're really talking about two elements of that. One is whether the U.S. will keep its word or the next administration will withdraw or not. And I'm just going to briefly address that and then move on to the next one, which I'm more I've worked on it more. So I 100% agree with Eric to resolve that issue, the credibility and the long-term commitment on these arms control and non-proliferation agreements. That's not going to be resolved for the JCPOA in time. And I do think that Iranians will understand that and do understand that. So I would put that in a category of the demands that could actually be negotiated, right? But what Eric mentions about whether the next president in US will withdraw or not, I think that really doesn't matter in the context of the JCPOA because the Iranians have to put their money on that actually happening because they have to prepare for a worst case scenario. They have to prepare for a situation where that happens and then their economy is going to be hit by another shock. And moreover, it also affects the rest of the global business sector and community and banks and everybody's perception. And I think everybody's money will also be on, or at least they will be very cautious in acknowledging that could be a fact. So that is going to really affect and have a sort of shadow on all of this for the Iranians anyways, regardless of whether that would be the case for the next president or not. I think that perception is what's shaping the cost benefit calculus. So really, if you think about, the officials sitting in Tehran doing a cost benefit calculus on what is this going to give them, they have to see what is it exactly in terms of tangible benefits. And they have said that over and over from this sanctions relief. What is it that they're going to actually see in the next 3 years or so that would be worth their while, even if all of that goes down the drain again in 3 years, right? So then we hear at the question of the assurances of the sanctions relief actually working. And I think this is very complicated, but this is something that I think it's doable within the time frame for the JCPOA. There are many people and experts who have worked on this, come up with creative solutions. And I actually think it is unfair to think that coming up with those out-of-the-box solutions to address this demand by Iran is sort of somehow is outside the scope of the JCPOA. And if the Iranians expect that, then they've got to do something more, because really we are in a situation where we have had the past few years play out for the Iranians, and we cannot ignore that happened and just assume that we're going to go back to square one, right? But I do understand the legal and political constraints on the US side to be able to address that. However, I do think that the US perfectly has the ability to potentially greenlight some of these out-of-the-box ideas and efforts to be done by allies and partners, either in the region or in Europe or in Asia, to provide specific guarantees on specific sanctions relief that Iranians are going to receive. Because really what they have learned is that the sanctions relief on paper, and this is exactly the point that Abdullahian stressed on his trip in New York, from why they're not picking up from where the talks in June left off. He specifically said that was just what's on paper. There was no guarantee of what does it actually mean or how does it actually translate into economic benefits. And as you can see, that's why they've had this huge delegation of experts on economy, banking, et cetera, as part of their negotiating team, because really their cost benefit calculus is going to come down to this. And unless there is some solutions, and ELN actually put out a report, I think last week, because I worked with Esfandiar also on this, and he and Sahil Shah have put on there are many different creative solutions. And I think those are not something that would need specific amount of time, because there could be waivers done by the Treasury, certain things that could be issued pretty fast. And it doesn't have to be US necessarily doing anything that would trigger an ARA or anything like that. So I think if that happens, and if there is enough political will, then we have a chance. But I do want to emphasize one last point on this, because I think this is an issue that needs to be resolved regardless of whether we are reviving the JCPOA or we're thinking of another deal. Because it really, you're expecting a country to give up to make concessions on a strategic asset, in this case, the nuclear program. Unless they draw benefit from elsewhere, that will not justify for them to make such concessions. It's just like basic cost benefit calculations. So it's going to get worse the more we go down the road. So while I'm with Eric, I think I'm pessimistic about JCPOA. I'm actually not any more optimistic about potential for another deal, because I think it would just be more difficult, if not, than this, because then you're opening up a can of worms and starting from square one, and then everybody has a ton of other demands that they want to add to this equation. And so I'm more pessimistic about that. And I understand politically, as you also questioned about sort of Biden administration, it's very difficult to sell in Washington to give anything, to a country with such sort of record of, human rights, you name it, to an adversary like Iran. But the issue is nobody wants to give anything to Iran. But the reality of the negotiations is, if you want to get something, you want to do that. And you want that country to benefit, not because you like them, but because you want them to comply with a deal. So when we're talking about, and as Eric mentioned, other than the credibility, this issue of having clear resulting sanctions relief, or I would say regulated and sort of smart kind of sanctions relief in place, is essential for any deal that we envision with Iran, whether it's JCPOA or a future deal, or any deal we envision in the future with North Korea. Because unless we have tangible benefits to deliver, or carrots, as some say it in Washington, there's not a deal to be reached, and it's not going to be sustainable. So I think this is an issue that I think we need to resolve regardless of where this is going. And it's better to be resolved and impact the JCPOA than for us to wait and have to even come up with more concessions down the line.
That's great. Now, but I want to get to the Iranian side of the equation. In order to do so, I'm actually going to take a question right now I have right here. This question's from Harold Walker. It says, the question is, Iran has a new government. How does the panel judge the internal pressures on that government relevant to the JCPOA? And I'm going to ask Trita, do you want to respond to that real quick?
Sure, happy to. I will also give some comments on the excellent comments that Eric and Masa gave.
Sure.
Look, another one of these things that was predictable. We all knew that if we went past June, there would be a new government in Iran, and it would be a very high likelihood that it would be a conservative one, and that government would have political pressure on itself to try to outperform the previous government, take a tougher stance against the United States. And I have to say, sometimes when I see some of the posturing of the current team, I do wonder if their primary concern is to get a better deal or to be able to say that they did more than what the Zarif Rouhani team did. I mean, this is not terribly different from what happened here in the United States, in which a leading motivation of Trump was to essentially undo what Obama had done and then to try to outdo him. So a bit of that dynamic seems to exist there as well. And this, again, was predictable. Everyone knew it. There were people who were writing that, we got to hurry and make sure that we don't pass that deadline. Now we're past it, and we're going to have to deal with the very complicated and more problematic dynamics that come with that. In regards to assurances, I like to use the word mechanisms instead, because I think that's at the end of the day what it is. It's not about something that the US gives in form of a promise. It's mechanisms that are put in place to make sure that the cost of an exit is sufficiently high to deter a government from exercising that option, at least making sure that it thinks twice about it. There was hardly any cost, at least in the mind of Donald Trump, for doing that back in 2018. And very little has been done to try to create any such cost structures now. There is a massive cost for the Iranians if they were to do this. The Obama team knew very well that they were not negotiating just with the Rouhani government. They were trying to make a deal with Iran. And they knew, of course, that the Rouhani government was not permanent. So they made sure that there was a snapback function put into the Security Council so that if the Iranians cheated or exited the deal, the US would not have to go through all of the motions to get the sanctions imposed back on Iran. It would be very swift. And as a result, the economic cost on Iran would be immense. There is no such mechanism in place right now to make sure that Iran is striking a deal with America and not just with whatever administration is in power. Eric makes the argument, and I think it's a valid argument, that some of these things may be very complicated, may take some time. Do keep in mind, however, these issues have been raised throughout. And there's been a 5-month break. And one of the things I've been concerned about is that I've just not seen the degree of effort on the US side to think about these things and come up with solutions. And in my recent conversations with those in Vienna, that was also not something that really came up from the US or European side. The Iranians raised it again. So time has also been lost trying to do some of those things. I'm not sure all of them would require as much as 5 months. And also, by the way, I want to emphasize, if we're looking for some sort of a silver bullet, then I think Eric is absolutely right. That's going to take some time. I don't think that's even achievable, frankly. I think there can be a series of mechanisms that altogether combined provides enough of a high cost for every side to exit so that it could be a deterrent. It cannot be a guarantee. It will not be legally binding, but it will change the cost-benefit analysis of any future administration. And as Eric pointed out, perhaps next time around, those other advisors will be able to make that case, not just for a year and a half, but perhaps a bit longer, precisely because of these things. One thing that I think would be interesting as well is, the UN Security Council resolution that embodies the JCPOA was designed in such a way that if you violate the JCPOA, you don't violate the UN Security Council resolution. Perhaps that can change, and that would actually go both ways, in the sense that if the Iranians violate the JCPOA, they violate the Chapter 7 resolution at the UN. So there's several layers of these things that I think can be done, will not take that much time, at least if we start thinking about it right away, that should be addressed. On the issue of a Republican president, I think Eric raised a very important point, and I do agree with him. But I only see 2 scenarios, one in which the US, under a Republican president, withdraws, and one in which a Republican president doesn't withdraw, but does exactly what Trump did in the first 18 months, which is to inject uncertainty as to whether he or she will stay in the deal or withdraw. And then that will have the same effect as withdrawing, because all of the businesses will nevertheless stop leaving Iran because they're not going to sit there and wait for a final decision. The third scenario is the one that I currently don't see. Perhaps zero is too strong of a word, but one in which an American president that is a Republican not only stays in the deal, but fully adheres to it and seeks to make sure that it is, if not strengthened, at least does not cast a question mark around it. That candidate I don't see right now. And I think that is a key reason as to why some of those concerns on the Iranian side cannot easily be dismissed.
Now, Trita, I have a quick follow-up for you. We have another question directed from Sina Azodi from, I believe he's at the Atlantic Council. Thanks for joining us, Sina. His question is, Trita mentioned mechanisms, and what kind of mechanism can be put so that the U.S. feels some quote unquote pain should the U.S. violate the agreement?
So you want me to start on that, Tom?
Yes, would you please?
And I'm sure Massa has spent some time on that, so
Sure.
I'll be brief. I mentioned the Security Council, and again, I'm not saying that that is going to be enough of a deterrent. I'm saying that layers of these kind of measures combined can be so. I also think that it would be valuable to make sure that there are encouragement for U.S. businesses to go into the deal, into the Iranian market. Remember, Boeing was written into the deal. And it appears that the way that cost was alleviated was that that was a roughly $42 billion deal that essentially was canceled as a result of the US leaving. But that was fixed by making sure that the UAE came in with a $57 billion deal. But if we actually have a series of American companies that use the existing mechanisms within the JCPOA to enter the Iranian market, if that had been done early on, I think, again, the cost-benefit analysis would have shifted a little bit. Would it have deterred someone as determined as Trump? Perhaps not. But not doing anything about this, I think, signals the other side that we either don't care or that we actually want the sanctions to be imposed in order to use it as leverage for future talk. That may not be the intent at all. I'm talking about how they may be perceiving it.
Eric, what do you think about the mechanisms as far as that could be put in place?
So I guess a couple of thoughts on the conversation so far, and I'm not an economist, so I want to be careful with what I say here. But look, I think we've got to go back to, are we trying to go back to the JCPOA, right? The deal that we all had, right? I think Zarif's op-ed was we want the deal we had, or are we trying to do something new? And when we talk a lot about these mechanisms, whether it's Trita mentioned changing 2231 or changing the relationship between the JCPOA and 2231, a lot of these things border on, if not are into the territory of changes to the JCPOA. And so that's not a judgment on whether or not they're possible or whether or not even they're good ideas. But that's a different conversation than just trying to focus on restoring the deal. And so I think that's where we kind of run into some potential problems when it comes to these talks are about trying to restore the JCPOA. And so that's, I think, where I differ slightly with Massa and Trita. I also think, going back to the question about the new Raisi administration, I mean, look, I think right now Iran's strategy, right, which is not it's not a new strategy. It's one Iran has pursued before, which is to try and use that nuclear leverage, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that it installed these new IR-6s and started using them to produce 20% during negotiations, but to take this nuclear leverage and try and use it to get a better deal at the negotiating table, right? That's something this is how Iran has used its nuclear program for a very long time. And so I think the strategy of the new administration is a continuation of that. I think they look at, they were all skeptics of the JCPOA. The experience of Trump reinforced that skepticism for them. And so I think their strategy, and I think right now they still probably believe, although perhaps this recent week has changed this a little bit, they still think that, I think their bet is that they can wear down the rest of the members of the JCPOA and try and get that better deal because of that nuclear leverage. And so I think we're not going to, until that calculation changes, I don't think we're going to be in a position where we have an opening to a diplomatic deal that's worth taking. And I'll stop there.
Sure. And Massa, starting on the Raisi administration, the pressures they may be facing from within, what's your take on that?
So I'm going to differ on this slightly with Trita, in the sense that when I put myself in their position, I'd be actually demanding similar things. So I have a hard time. Yes, I can understand the political incentive to try to outdo what the previous administration has done. That's obviously there. But whether, if that were not to be the case, a deal would have been made right now, I'm not sure, because, and it gets back to where Eric ended the conversation, which is, yes, that is true. Iranians have always done this. What they're selling at the negotiating table is threat of a bomb, right? And this is why what the West is interested in buying. If you think about sort of this negotiation, so they will do that, and they will ramp up, and they will do so not necessarily because they want to just add and get a better deal, but because they want to put enough pressure to stay within the timeline and make sure things happen. And I think where I disagree with you, I don't think here the sticking point is whether the Iranians actually want to have a deal or not. I think this goes back again to this question of whether the sanctions relief will actually deliver or not. And they're not clear whether it delivers and how much it delivers. So until that's resolved, we're not going to have a deal. And I actually, I think, agree with Eric and disagree with Trita about assurances or mechanisms in terms of US leaving. I don't think that is something that is feasible. At this point, it's a great idea, but I also agree that it's not feasible. And I also agree that it borders, if not sort of be outside the scope of the JCPOA. What I'm suggesting, which it is not outside of the JCPOA, is to make sure the sanctions relief that was promised under the JCPOA happens and delivers, and it's not undermined. And that's what the Iranians are basically asking. And so the mechanisms that would need to be put in place to do that, I cannot imagine by any means or stretch, because there's no political or legal or any kind of commitment except that making sure the sanctions relief that was promised under the JCPOA is going to deliver, that there will be banking transactions happening without taking 2 years just to get some money transferred from country X to country Y. And I actually think there's an opportunity here, because that requires us to be more proactive and taking more steps in terms of not being like, we're going to sign a paper and relieve the sanction and then we're done with it. It's up to the Iranians to go figure out what they want to do with it. We can be more proactive, but I think the additional thing that we could gain through being more proactive and doing more through allies again and partners to provide that relief is be a little bit more sort of engineering what that relief would look like. We can try to, the same way as how much time we spend on how we sanction, who we sanction to get to a particular result, we can do the same thing. We can have the same kind of team and expertise from different sides to look at what kind of sanctions relief will actually be appealing to the Iranians, but also beneficial to us in the long run. What kind of alternative energy source investments, water, food, agriculture, all of the things that are supposedly, some of them actually exempt from the sanctions right now, but they're still not happening, but they would if we were proactively greenlighting them, the same way as we proactively red light things, even if they're not under sanction. So that, I think, is really by default a requirement for revival of the JCPOA, and those mechanisms, I think, absolutely should be revived. And I understand where Eric is coming from, but I think if we should always do this when we're thinking about how the other side is making decisions. You got to think, what are they getting in return, and is it going to be worth their while or not? It's as simple as that. And if they're not going to know what is it exactly that they're getting, because in 2015, this approach worked because there was this perception that once the sanctions relief happens, everything is going to be okay. It was a misperception on the side of the Iranians. I agree to some part, but for everybody. So that is there. But given everything that has happened, I think it is an absolute requirement to have some clarity of at least very specific and practical, tangible economic benefits that the Iranians will draw from it, and then see whether then they would say yes or no. And I don't think we have anything to lose by having such offers at this point.
And Masa,
could I
yes,
give a
please,
quick
go
comment? I think Masa's what she's pointing to is very important, and what I want to say in regards to the assurances as to whether they would be making it a new deal or not, I think a principle that should be followed there is that if we're actually asking the United States to give, for instance, more sanctions relief, not just secondary sanctions, or instead do primary sanctions, or if we're asking the Iranians to go further down on how much LEU they can keep, for instance, they could keep 300, we'll make it 200. That, in my view, is a substantive change of the JCPOA, and I agree fully with Eric and Masa and virtually everyone in the negotiating team that no one is looking for that. However, If it is about creating mechanisms that ensures that what has been promised is delivered, and mechanisms that ensures that it's more difficult to be able to exit the deal, I don't see that actually being a substantive change of the JCPOA. So perhaps it will become a bit of a definitional issue. I would still make a pitch for a very simple reason, even though it's difficult. However difficult it is less difficult than a scenario in which, if there is a second exit of the JCPOA, to make sure that we can revive it then. I think it's a miracle that after the first American exit, the JCPOA is still there and we can actually have a panel discussion about what we can do to revive it. Does anyone on the panel believe that a second American exit would still allow the JCPOA to survive? Does JCPOA would survive a second American exit? I don't see that. So if we do think, and I think the administration clearly thinks, that this is in the national interest of the United States, that it's critical to make sure that the nuclear program is boxing, cannot lead to a pathway to war, it's critical to make sure that there's not a military confrontation in Iran, then I don't see why we should not put much more effort in making sure that we cannot endure what we did before, because it simply will not survive that a second exit. And then we will be in a very, very bad situation.
Thank you for that. One thing I do want to make sure that we cover here, and there's some questions on it right now from our viewers, our listeners right now, is the idea of this geopolitical shift that Iran has done over the past few years, sort of towards Russia and China, towards the east, economically, sometimes in militarily in certain ways. We've seen joint exercises, and we've seen strategic agreements such as with China, the 25-year deal, and we've also seen some contacts of that, and with Russia too. It's obviously Iran and Syria, Iran and Russia are already active in Syria together. So one question I do want to ask, it comes from Abdul Sufi. What are the views of the panelists about the impact of Sino-Iranian 25-year trade investment agreement on the U.S. sanctions against Iran? And to just add to that, there's another question here from Xiaoning Huang, who says, with the world being increasingly divided into two camps, US, EU on one side, Russia, China on the other, how do speakers assess Iran's calculations on Russian Chinese support to it, including on the nuclear issue, give that Moscow and Beijing share Iranians' view as the root cause of the current crisis, rested with the US withdrawing from the deal? So broadly, I guess what I want to ask those questions are essentially, what is the effect of Iran's close relations now with China and Russia, economically, politically, diplomatically, on the Iranian calculations? And I'll ask that to Masa first, if you'd like to respond.
Thank you. Sure. I'm going to take a crack at it first. I'm sure Trita would be much more suited
we'll get to him.
speak on this. But so actually, again, going back to one of the points that Trita mentioned about having more American businesses, and that's why I thought sort of those mechanisms are not timely. I think knowing the Raisi administration and sort of some of the shifts in Iran, sort of, I would say, strategic vision, that this faction or this group of people who are now in different decision-making positions in Tehran pursue, I think maybe not the prime time to better relations in general with the United States. So to me, I've put that aside. So if I'm thinking about it, it's just if we can contain the situation and not get into an escalatory cycle for the next few years, then we can slowly move towards a different direction between sort of US-Iran, whether it's on the business, etc. But what I think about sort of, we can utilize actually this Iran sort of shift towards East, Russia and China, because all of these agreements and every transaction that is in place currently between Russia and China, in a way, is either constrained or it could thrive a lot more if the US sanctions were not in place, right? And so there is an interest on the Chinese side, on the Iranian side, to sort of get out of this, nuclear disagreement or crisis or whatever we call it, to sort of be able to pursue those interests together. So that's why I think it's more feasible, and it may not be 100% desirable, but it would be good to sort of actually allow and green light potentially Russia, China, and it's not just Russia and China. Iran is looking towards Central Asia, different countries in the Asia. We have Great Al, we have Japan, South Korea. Those could pick up these. And so if we can actually basically utilize Iran's approach towards its neighbors, towards Central Asia, towards Russia, China, and Asia as a whole manage it and try to have them build the kind of economic relationship that we cannot right now build with the Iranians. And this government is not as much interested to do so with the Europeans and the Americans for a variety of reasons. Then I think this actually could work to our advantage in a ways. And I do think generally Iran is not going to build alliances with Russia and China, at least given the circumstances. So this is just going to be transactional as it has been before. So I don't think this sort of provides any particular worry on sort of a strategic competition between US and China if Iran were to sort of strengthen or have more economic deals with China down the line. And I don't think it will monopolize that anyways, because there's so much internal backlash on these issues and debate on these issues as well. So I think it will end up being balanced, but I do think we can use it to our advantage rather than try to sort of worry about it as much, but I may be wrong. So,
Eric, do you have anything to add on this geopolitical shift and how that could affect not only the chances, the feasibility of the deal itself, but also just the general mood of the talks and perhaps even U.S. perceptions?
Yeah, no, thanks, Tom. I agree with Masa. I mean, I think this relationship has been and will continue to be for the foreseeable future more transactional between Iran and China, to be sure. I do think, of course, my lights always go off as soon as I'm the one talking here. Apologies for that. I do think U.S.-China tensions do have some, albeit perhaps limited, negative ramifications for talks. I do see that spilling over a bit, and this is, of course, is happening with regard to the obvious one being Chinese purchases of Iranian oil. That's continuing. I think if the U.S. Does ever pivot to sort of a plan B type strategy, I think that's going to be probably one of the first areas that it tries to tackle. Probably will try to tackle it diplomatically at first, before resulting to some types of sanctions implementation. But I think that's going to be a real difficult issue moving out in the future if the U.S. decides to take that plan B strategy. I will say diplomatically, China and Russia are always kind of that diplomatic buffer for Iran, right? Between Iran and the US and the E3, right? And so I think one of the things that's always, I think, helped nudge Iran in the right direction is when even Russia starts to get a little bit angsty at some of the things that Iran is doing and starts to nudge the Iranians and say, hey, this is really starting to cross the line. This is really unacceptable. That's always been a really important, I think, role that Russia can play. And so hopefully after this latest round of talks, it's doing just that and trying to impress the seriousness of some of these developments on Iran. But I think that's, we'll just talk about it in the context of some of the ways that this is impacting current talks and current dynamics.
Sure. Trita, you want to lead?
No, I've got nothing to add. Those were great answers.
Fantastic. So one thing I also want to cover now, we have a lot of questions about the impact of Israel. And because we're a little low on time right now, I'd also like to add, because I believe there's some questions about this as well, the role of Israel and also the role of Iranian budding relations with UAE and Saudi Arabia. Basically, Iran's sort of relationships in the Middle East and how that is affecting the calculus in the JCPOA right now. I'm going to put you on the spot, Trita, for this one first.
Sure. Thank you. I think it's quite interesting to see, the Biden administration obviously was quite pleased to see that Netanyahu was no longer there. Their earlier efforts during the first couple of months to try to create a situation in which by increasing consultations, et cetera, they would be able to get Bibi to tone down his opposition to the JCPOA, not to sabotage it, not play politics in the US, didn't go very far. But then with Bennett coming in, there was high hopes, I think, or at least some moderate hopes that it would be more successful. And I think on the surface, it was. Bennett did not take the same harsh positions publicly as long as nothing was happening diplomatically. But in the last week or two, we have seen that on substance, the Bennett government really does not differ that dramatically from what the Netanyahu government did. And in fact, Bennett came out and urged Tony Blinken to just stop the talks altogether, which is really not terribly different from what before. So I was always skeptical about this idea that there is a way to find some sort of a happy medium with the Israelis on this issue. And I'm not surprised to see that this is where it's led to. And it comes down to the fact that at the end of the day, If the Iranians want to have the deal, they're going to have to make some tough compromises and pay some form of a political price. Same thing is true for the United States, and there's going to be a price to be paid in the relationship with Israel. It's just not avoidable. So you really just have to ask yourself, is this deal worth it or not, rather than trying to find a way to please all sides at the same time. I do think on the Israeli front, one thing that is really, really important to note, it has been fascinating to see a large number of former Israeli officials in the security establishment that are increasingly coming out, speaking out and saying that the withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA and Bibi's role in pushing Trump to do so was a massive mistake, because the Iranian nuclear program is now far more advanced than it ever has been. Few of them said things of that kind before. Now a larger number is coming out. And I think this is really important because it's essentially an admission on the Israeli side that their own actions, including assassinations and sabotage, have directly contributed to the current mess that we're in right now. And I hope that that is not just a data point that is recorded and noted, but it also impacts both how the administration takes the advice of the Israelis on this issue, but also how the media covers the comments from the Israelis, particularly the Israeli government right now, because what they have been doing has been utterly unhelpful to U.S. national interests. When it comes to what's happening between Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, it is absolutely fascinating to see that as the regional states have become increasingly convinced that the United States' commitment militarily to the region is not what it was before. It doesn't matter whether the numbers are going down. It's that no one is convinced any longer that the US is going to fight in the region. That has prompted these states to all start to scramble and look for diplomatic solutions between themselves, because suddenly diplomacy is much more attractive when you don't have the backing of the United States. The issue, though, is if the JCPOA is not struck and revived, then I personally don't suspect that some of this diplomacy will continue in the manner that it has right now. It is continuing precisely because these states are calculating that the US is not committed to their security, and the US and Iran is going to strike a deal, so they themselves need to try to find their own diplomatic options with Iran. But if the Iranians mess this up, if the US side messed up on the JCPOA, then I think we will go back to the previous dynamic, which is a much worse one, in which these sides do not talk to each other and are essentially only focusing on their negative forms of competition with each other.
And Masa, what do you think? Do you think that the JCPOA talks and Iran's diplomacy with its Arab neighbors are linked? And how about the Israeli threat?
Great. I'm just going to follow up on where Trita ended, which is there is one caveat to this, which is I think my understanding of, and I completely agree with everything he said, except that I will add that I think this is kind of a lifeline to them. Also, in the case that the JCPOA fails and the US and Iran get into an escalatory cycle, because they got caught very much so in the fire before, it seems to me that they also want to hedge their bets to make sure that they can minimize the impact that potentially, again, another escalatory cycle between Iran and US, and Iran starting sort of, accelerating operations in the region. Every country wants to see less of it on their territory and more of it elsewhere. So it seems to me that element is there. But I'm not very optimistic that these talks will progress enough to that point that will actually act as a restraint for Tehran in terms of how it will conduct its operations, because that's sort of a whole different dynamic. But I still think any kind of this diplomatic efforts are welcome, regardless of whether they lead to a breakthrough or not. I think always having these channels open is better than not having them. It creates more understanding, and it sort of, I think even if they end at some point, when they restart again, it would not be from square one. That I really am a believer that these diplomatic efforts, when they fail and then you resume, you're not, this will impact how the follow-on diplomacy is gonna proceed. So I'm actually very supportive of this, even though I'm not very optimistic. On the Israeli factor, I think it's actually an important point, and that's one of the reasons why I I wish and I hope that we would focus more on what kind of out-of-the-box economic relief we can provide now and have the JCPOA revive than being focused on the post-talks failing plans, because I'm not very optimistic about another deal other than the JCPOA, and I'm not very optimistic about an interim deal, frankly. And the reason comes down to Israel, as you mentioned, because if we get into an interim deal situation, I think Israelis were going to ramp up their covert operations. And that's going to hugely impact Iran's cost benefit calculus and add to the volatility of the situation even more so. And if you take into account all the sides, and I'm pessimistic about an interim deal also because I don't see why and how either side, US or Iran, will give up their most valuable assets for an interim deal, because everybody wants to hold what's their valuable to them. And I don't think that's going to be good enough for the US and for us to sort of provide the kind of economic relief that they're looking for. So to me, that's really sort of not very promising. And then add to that the unknown factor of the Israeli attacks and how that could escalate. And I'll end with this, which is something that came up actually as many questions during Manama dialogue, which was one thing that is not at all clear either to the Iranians and also to the other countries in the region, and I think it's very dangerous that is not clear, is first of all, whether the red line for an Israeli attack is overlapping with the US red line or not. Because Americans talk about Iran not getting a nuclear weapon and the Israelis talk about weapons capability. And second of all, we're no longer actually in the zone of talking about a red line. There's no longer a line, there's a zone. And so that creates so much, miscalculation, because there is really not a line that Iranians think whether we cross or not. It's really a zone, and then it's very much unclear who's going to take action at one point. So all of this, I think, plays into a very uncertain and potentially very dangerous scenario.
So I think we're running to the end of our program. Eric, do you want to give a final word on that?
No, well, I would give one, but it would leave us on a very pessimistic note and not an optimistic one. So
nothing you have said so far, Eric, is optimistic. So just go for it.
I mean, look, I mean, I think Mas's point is very well taken about it's quite unclear. The U.S. officials have kind of alluded to, we're not going to keep waiting. There may be a point at which we have to go to other options. I think that, I think the U.S. should think very, very deliberately about what that point is. Because I think my personal view is there is a very narrow range of scenarios under which the United States may actually want to undertake military action to prevent Iran from actually going for a bomb. I think it's very narrow, but I think they need to think seriously about that. Now, the optimistic note I would like to end on. There's talk about some of the threats that the Israelis have made about potentially needing to strike. I think that's, obviously they have multiple audiences for those messages. One is the Iranians, another one are the Americans, because they want to keep us focused on the Iranian problem set as well. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that that's just all bark and no bite. Given where Iran's nuclear advances are, I do think there's a real serious risk, there's a real serious chance that Israel could undertake some type of military or significant covert action. And the positive note is that in addition to the comments that Trita noted, that Israeli officials have been talking about, all of the why leaving the JCPOA was such a terrible decision. You've also heard Israeli officials come out and talk about, yes, Iran has made massive amounts of progress on uranium enrichment, but it is still about 1 to 2 years away from actually having a nuclear weapon, even if it were to produce that fissile material, and that the Iranians have not, apparently, according to Israeli intelligence, given that order to produce it. So it suggests we are not yet at that point of Iran dashing for a nuclear weapon, and there is still time, albeit a small amount of time.
That's a great note to end on, Eric. Appreciate it. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's words today. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I'll hand it off. You guys want to say your final goodbyes and everything? Obviously, you know how to reach us. Contact us for any further up information. I'd like to thank the Quincy Institute, Kelly, Sam, everyone who put this together. And thanks for having me. I hope you guys enjoyed.
Thank you.